The Russia-Ukraine war is more than a geopolitical conflict. It has had ripple effects that are being felt across the globe, particularly in terms of food security. In this video, we'll explore how the war has disrupted global food supply chains, created massive price shocks, exacerbated hunger, and further destabilized fragile economies, all while outlining how the world is grappling with this complex crisis. To understand the gravity of the situation, it's essential to recognize the critical role that both Russia and Ukraine play in global food production. Ukraine has long been known as the breadbasket of Europe, a country with vast, fertile lands ideally suited for agricultural production. Before the war, Ukraine was among the world's largest exporters of wheat, corn, barley, and sunflower oil. In 2021, Ukraine provided about 10% of global wheat exports and was responsible for half of the world's sunflower oil supply. Russia is also a major agricultural producer, particularly of wheat and fertilizers. Together, Russia and Ukraine accounted for nearly 30% of global wheat exports. Russia also plays a pivotal role in the global fertilizer market, producing essential nutrients like potash, nitrogen, and phosphorus. These are critical not only for Russian farmers but also for farmers across the world who rely on Russian exports to grow their own crops. When war broke out in February 2022, it triggered an unprecedented disruption in the global food supply chain. Let's explore the cascading effects this conflict has had on food security around the globe. The war has ravaged much of Ukraine's agricultural land, especially in the eastern and southern regions. These are the very areas where some of Ukraine's most fertile lands are located, and they have been heavily impacted by military activity, displacing farmers, destroying equipment, and disrupting the planting and harvesting cycles. In the first few months of the conflict, fields that were once lush with wheat and corn lay idle, either because they were riddled with unexploded ordnance or because farmers had fled the fighting. Further complicating matters, Ukraine's agricultural infrastructure, including storage silos, roads, and railways, has been heavily targeted, making it difficult for what little harvest could be gathered to reach export markets. With key ports like Mariupol and Odessa under siege or blockaded, Ukraine's ability to export grain to the world effectively ground to a halt. For many developing nations, these supply disruptions have had immediate and dire consequences. With Ukraine and Russia both out of commission as major grain exporters, the global grain market was thrown into chaos. Wheat, in particular, saw massive price spikes. In March 2022, wheat prices hit a 14-year high, with markets reacting to the uncertainty of how long the war would last and what that would mean for global food supplies. Countries in North Africa and the Middle East were especially vulnerable. Many of these nations rely on Ukrainian and Russian wheat imports to feed their populations. Egypt, for instance, is the world's largest importer of wheat, and a significant portion of its supply comes from these two countries. When the supply chains from Ukraine and Russia were disrupted, nations like Egypt, Lebanon, and Yemen faced an immediate food crisis. These regions were already struggling with rising food prices due to inflation and economic pressures, and the war compounded the situation, leading to food shortages and exacerbating hunger in these regions. In other parts of the world, the disruption of grain exports from Ukraine and Russia sent shockwaves through food prices. The cost of bread, pasta, and other staple foods rose sharply, affecting consumers globally. Russia's role in the global food system isn't limited to grain production. As one of the world's leading producers of fertilizers, Russia supplies about 20% of the global nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers and 40% of the potash market. When the war began, sanctions and export restrictions imposed on Russia as a result of its invasion of Ukraine created a fertilizer shortage. Fertilizer prices, which were already on the rise due to pandemic-related supply chain disruptions, skyrocketed further. For farmers in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, this has meant a dramatic increase in their production costs. The sharp increase in fertilizer prices led many farmers to reduce the amount of fertilizer they applied to their crops, which in turn has resulted in lower crop yields. This fertilizer shortage has also led to a vicious cycle. Reduced yields mean less food is available on global markets, leading to further price increases, exacerbating food insecurity for the world's most vulnerable populations. Beyond crops, the war in Ukraine has also impacted global livestock production. Ukraine and Russia are major suppliers of animal feed, including corn and barley. When these supplies were disrupted, the price of animal feed soared, leading to higher costs for livestock farmers. In many parts of the world, farmers were forced to cull animals because they could no longer afford to feed them. The reduction in livestock herds has put additional pressure on the supply of meat and dairy products, causing their prices to increase as well. For lower-income countries, where families spend a significant portion of their income on food, these rising prices have created a serious burden. For example, in countries across sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, the price of basic foodstuffs like bread, meat, and dairy has climbed to levels that many can no longer afford. The war in Ukraine has been a major contributor to the global hunger crisis. According to the World Food Programme, WFP, the war has pushed millions of people closer to famine, particularly in regions already facing high levels of food insecurity, like East Africa, Yemen, and Afghanistan. The combination of rising food prices, disrupted trade, and reduced access to food has created a perfect storm for hunger. In 2022, the WFP reported that the number of people facing acute hunger globally had risen by 50 million, bringing the total to more than 345 million. Countries that are heavily dependent on food imports, especially from Ukraine and Russia, are among the hardest hit. In places like Somalia, where drought and conflict have already decimated food production, the loss of affordable grain from Ukraine has pushed the nation to the brink of famine. Yemen, already devastated by years of civil war, is another country where the impact of the Ukraine war is felt. With food prices rising and the supply of wheat from Ukraine cut off, millions of Yemenis are facing starvation. In response to the crisis, international organizations, governments, and NGOs have mobilized efforts to mitigate the worst effects. The UN, for instance, brokered a deal in July 2022 called the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which allowed Ukrainian grain shipments to resume through the Black Sea under the supervision of Turkey and the UN. This agreement was crucial in alleviating some of the pressure on global food prices and ensuring that grain could reach countries that were most in need. Although the agreement helped stabilize the situation somewhat, it did not fully resolve the crisis, and food prices remained elevated. Governments around the world have also taken steps to shield their populations from rising food prices. Many countries, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, increased subsidies on food staples to prevent unrest. However, this is a temporary solution and places further strain on government budgets that are already stretched thin. In wealthier nations, governments have had to balance providing food aid to the world's most vulnerable populations with addressing their own domestic food inflation challenges. The United States, the European Union, and other major economies have pledged billions in aid to mitigate the global food crisis, but there is still much more to be done. It's important to recognize that the war in Ukraine is occurring in the context of a global food system already strained by climate change. Extreme weather events, such as droughts, floods, and heatwaves, have significantly reduced food production in many parts of the world. The war has exacerbated an already fragile system. For example, East Africa has been enduring its worst drought in decades, decimating crops and livestock. Coupled with the food price spikes caused by the war, the region is facing a severe hunger crisis. Similarly, climate change has made food production more unpredictable and expensive. The war's impact on energy prices has further compounded the crisis, as higher fuel costs make it more expensive to transport and produce food. The Russia-Ukraine war is a stark reminder of how interconnected the world's food system is. The longer the war drags on, the more entrenched these disruptions will become. Even if the war were to end tomorrow, it would take years to rebuild Ukraine's agricultural sector and restore global food supply chains to pre-war levels. This conflict has exposed the vulnerabilities of relying too heavily on a small number of countries for critical food supplies. As a result, many nations are now rethinking their agricultural policies, looking to diversify their food sources, and investing in domestic food production to reduce their dependence on imports. For the international community, the war in Ukraine highlights the need for a more resilient and sustainable global food system. Addressing these challenges will require coordinated efforts to not only resolve the immediate food crisis but also address the underlying structural problems in the global food system, from climate change to income inequality. The Russia-Ukraine war has had a profound impact on global food security. It has disrupted food supplies, raised prices, and pushed millions into hunger. The crisis has exposed the vulnerabilities in the global food system and underscored the urgent need for action. While international efforts have provided some relief, the war has made clear that more must be done to create a food system that is resilient, equitable, and capable of withstanding future shocks. Only by addressing these challenges head-on can we hope to prevent the next global food crisis and ensure that everyone has access to affordable, nutritious food.